Samson's story, chapters 14 and 15. In Ecclesiastes, which we studied, we learned in verse 8 of chapter 7, the end of a matter is better than its beginning. The problem with Samson's life is that a good beginning doesn't guarantee a good ending. And he had a good beginning because he was blessed by God from the very beginning of his life, even before he was born. God came to his parents and told them that they'd have a son, and he would be a Nazirite. And this was a very special person who had special qualities and characteristics, qualifications. The Nazirite vow included not cutting your hair, and for this reason Samson did have long hair. It meant that you do not get around a dead body, and that you drink no wine. These are a few of the things. It also included a moral standard, especially when it comes to sexuality. And of course, he broke every one of his vows as far as a Nazirite is concerned. And we already made note of some of that. We note tonight that he goes to spend the night with a prostitute, and then he also ends up with Delilah, who was his downfall. One of the things about Samson is God did bless him in many ways, and he did have great faith, because the Hebrew writer, chapter 11, says that he did. And he had love for God. We see that in the text. But he was one of these people that thought he could do it alone. He was a man who yielded to his passions. For example, he had a passion to get even. When everything happened to him personally, he went out and got even with it, and would kill people over it. He also had a passion for private battles. He didn't do like the other judges did and went out and did his battles for the Lord. He did it all on his own. He also had an anger issue. He had ungodly anger instead of godly anger. And there's nothing wrong with godly anger. We all ought to have that. That's anger against sin. And we all ought to have that kind of anger. For example, Israel at this time, this is the longest they went before they got Samson as a judge. They went 40 years under the oppression of the Philistines. And they had no army, they had no weapons. They were just at the mercy of the Philistines. And Samson did not get an army together. He did not help them get any weapons. He spent his time in Philistine territory doing a few things to upset the cart, basically. As a matter of fact, the only group of people that got together was about 3,000 men, we'll notice here before we conclude tonight, got together to turn Samson over to the Philistines. That's kind of odd. They couldn't get 3,000 men together to fight, but they got 3,000 men together to go to a cave where he was hiding out and to tie him up and hand him over to the Philistines. So it's a very strange situation. The men of Judah considered him a troublemaker. So the citizens were willing to turn the God-appointed leader over to the enemy. A very strange situation. Of course, many things about the judges was very strange, I thought. Now let's start our text in chapter 14. Samson's, chapter 15. We already discussed that one. In chapter 15, verse 1, we have Samson's vengeance on the Philistines. And you remember, we already studied that Samson found a woman that he wanted to marry. And the father and mother in chapter 14 did not want him to do it because she was a Philistine. She was from Timnah, and they had a wedding, though. And Samson did not consummate the wedding. It turned out that his father-in-law gave Samson's bride over to the best man. Now, here's another strange thing. Now, Samson's going to go back and think that he can consummate this wedding. He got angry and went home. Because of some incidents that happened there at the wedding, and he got mad and went home. Then he decided to go back and check on his bride and spend some time with her. So it says in chapter 15, verse 1, later on at the time of the wheat harvest, Samson took a young goat and went to visit his wife. He said, I'm going to my wife's room. But her father would not let him go in. Now we understand why. Because in verse 2 it says, I was so sure you hated her. That's what his father-in-law said. That I gave her to your companion. Isn't her younger sister more attractive? Take her instead. But of course, Samson was not pleased about that. Now, notice again his personal vengeance issues. In verse 3, Samson said to them, this time I have a right to get even with the Philistines. I will really harm them. So he went out and caught 300 foxes, tied them tail to tail in pairs. Then he fastened a torch to every pair of tails, lit the torches, and let the foxes loose in the standing grain of the Philistines. He burned up the shocks, the standing grain, together with the vineyards and the olive groves. Now, you could see how this would very much anger the Philistines. So in verse 6, they ask, who did this? They were told Samson, the Timnite's son-in-law, because his wife was given to his companion. It was because of a personal issue that he went out and did this. So the Philistines went up, and notice what they did to his bride-to-be, which was given to the best man, burned her and her father to death. Now he's got another vengeance to deal with. Samson said to them, since you've acted like this, I swear that I won't stop until I get my revenge on you. He attacked them viciously and slaughtered many of them. Then he went down and stayed in a cave in the rock of Edom. Now this is where the 3,000 people of Israel get together and want to turn him over to the Philistines. The Philistines, verse 9, went up, camped in Judah, spreading out near Lehi. The people of Judah asked, why have you come to fight us? We have come to take Samson prisoner, they answered, to do to him as he did to us. Then 3,000 men from Judah, these are Israelites, Samson's own people, went down to the cave in the rock of Edom and said to Samson, don't you realize that the Philistines are rulers over us? What have you done to us? So they felt that he was incompetent as a leader. They felt he didn't do anything for them. He answered, I merely did to them what they did to me. You see what I mean? It's all personal. They said to him, we've come to tie you up and hand you over to the Philistines. Samson said, swear to me that you won't kill me yourselves. Agreed, they answered. We will only tie you up and hand you over to them. We will not kill you. So they bound him with 2 new ropes, led him up from the rock. As he approached Lehi, the Philistines came toward him shouting. The Spirit of the Lord came powerfully upon him. God rescued him so many times. That's what it means by the Spirit of the Lord coming over him. The ropes on his arms became like charred flax. They would just fell off. And the bindings dropped from his hands. Finding a fresh jawbone of a donkey, he grabbed it, struck down 1,000 men. He was an army in himself, and maybe that was his downfall. He didn't realize that even though God was using him to destroy the Philistines, that he should have been a judge like the rest of them were, got an army together, got some weapons together, and not tried to do it all on his own. So Samson said in verse 16, with a donkey's jawbone I made a donkey's of them, mocking them. With a donkey's jawbone I killed 1,000 men. When he finished speaking, he threw away the jawbone, and the place was called Ramoth Lehi. Because he was very thirsty, he cried out to the Lord, You have given your servant this great victory. Must I now die of thirst and fall into the hands of the uncircumcised? Then God opened up the hollow place in Lehi, and water came out of it. When Samson drank, his strength was renewed, and he revived. So the spring was called En-Hakkore, and it is still there in Lehi. Samson led Israel for 20 years in the days of the Philistines. So twice it's mentioned that he led them for 20 years. And yet he was not able to deliver them from the enemy until actually at the time of his death. God still used him, but it was in death that he was used to destroy the leaders of the Philistines. Then we see the terrible story of Samson and Delilah, and how he couldn't, how he allowed himself to be tempted, how he allowed himself to be in situations so that this woman could take advantage of him. We really can't understand. In chapter 16, verse 1, it says, one day Samson went to Gaza. Now this is before he even went with Delilah. This prostitute was not named. One day Samson went to Gaza, where he saw a prostitute. He went in to spend the night with her. The people of Gaza were told Samson is here, so they surrounded the place, lay in wait for him at night at the city gate. They made no move during the night, saying at dawn we'll kill him. And of course, he escapes. Now this is his famous scene where he takes the city gates and walks off with them. Now this is an amazing feat. But Samson lay there only till the middle of the night. He was with the prostitute half the night. Then he got up, took hold of the doors of the city gate, together with the 2 posts, and tore them loose, bar and all. He lifted them up to his shoulders, carried them to the top of the hill that faces Hebron. Sometime later, now that story's over, sometime later he fell in love with a woman in the valley of Zorach whose name was Delilah. Now this was the beginning of the end for him. The rulers of the Philistines went to her and said, See if you can lure him into showing you the secret of his great strength and how we can overpower him so we may tie him up and subdue him. Each of us will give you 1,100 shekels of silver. So her motive was money. Plus she was a Philistine. She sided with the Philistines. And now she was making this effort to get him into the hands of the Philistines so that they could kill him. So Delilah said to Samson, Tell me the secret of your great strength and how you can be tied up and subdued. Samson answered her, If anyone, now he's going to give her 4 different answers. And he's playing with her. He's instead of taking seriously his vows, his hair was not to be cut. he was not to be around a dead body, and yet we see him in with the carcass of a lion and getting the honey and having a riddle for his enemies at the marriage. We see him drinking wine and so on with the party with the bridal party. And we see him betraying his vow of holiness by spending time with these prostitutes. And now this is the final straw. He's playing around with this idea about his hair. He knew that his strength was in his hair. Samson answered her, "If anyone ties me with 7 fresh bowstrings that have not been dried, I'll become as weak as any other." So the rulers of the Philistines in verse 8 brought her 7 fresh bowstrings that had not been dried, and she tied him with them. With men hidden in the room, she called to him, "Samson, the Philistines are upon you." But he snapped the bowstrings as easily as a piece of string snaps when it comes close to a flame, so the secret of his strength was not discovered. The same thing happened again, verse 11. He told her, "If anyone ties me secretly with new ropes that have never been used, I'll become as weak as any other." Delilah took the new ropes, tied him. Then she said, "Samson, the Philistines are upon you." He snapped the ropes off his arms. And then Delilah said in 13, "All this time you've been making a fool of me and lying to me. Tell me how you can be tied." He replied, "Another false thing. If you weave the 7 braids of my head into fabric on the loom and tighten it with a pin, I'll become as weak as any other man." He was making a game out of this. So while he was sleeping, Delilah took the 7 braids of his head, wove them into fabric, tightened it with a pin. Again she called to him, "Samson, the Philistines are upon you." He woke from his sleep, pulled up the pin and the loom with the fabric. Then she said to him, "How can you say I love you when you won't confide in me? This is the 3rd time you have made a fool of me and haven't told me the secret of your great strength." With such nagging, she prodded him day after day until he was sick to death of it. You would think that he would have had time to think this through, what she was trying to do to him. She said he was making a fool of her. Well, she was making a fool of him. So the tragedy is in verse 17. He told her everything. "No razor's ever been on my head, because I've been a Nazirite dedicated to God from my mother's womb. If my head were shaved, my strength would leave. I'd become as weak as any other man." Now then in the verses following, in 18 and 19, it happened. She did what he said. His hair was cut after putting to sleep on her lap. She called for someone to shave off the 7 braids of his hair and began to subdue him. His strength left. Verse 20, "Samson," she called, "the Philistines are on you." He awoke from his sleep and thought, "I'll go out as before, shake myself free." He was testing God and lost the test. But he did not know that the Lord had left him. You see, Jesus, even in his dealings with Satan and his temptation, tells us that you don't tempt the Lord God. Then the Philistines seized him, gouged out his eyes, verse 21, took him down to Gaza, binding him with the bronze shackles, set him to grinding grain in the prison. All this was to humiliate him. In the King James, we read that they even got a young boy. It doesn't mention it, bring it out in the NIV, to lead him around, to humiliate him. And you see, this isn't just bringing down a giant of a man. This has to do with now the Philistines thinking their God is greater than Israel's God. It brought reproach on the nation of Israel and also on God himself. But at least in the end, Samson is able to do something to help the country. We see that the hair on his head began to grow again after it had been shaved. Verse 23. Now the rulers of the Philistines assembled to offer a great sacrifice to Dagon. You see, they were thrilled that they could praise Dagon because now their leader, Samson, was in their hands. To celebrate, saying, our God has delivered Samson, our enemy, into our hands. When the people saw him, they praised their God, saying, our God has delivered our enemy into our hands, and the one who laid waste our land and multiplied our slain. While they were in high spirits, they shouted, bring out Samson to entertain us. We don't know what the entertainment was like. It was a mocking type thing. So they called Samson out of the prison, and he performed. I don't know what kind of performance he gave. It wasn't lifting weights, even though his strength came back, because he was getting ready to pull something over on them. So I don't know what he performed, but I'm sure it was a mockery. While they were in high spirits, bring out Samson to entertain us. So they called Samson out of the prison, and he performed for them when they stood him among the pillars. Now this is the pillars of this temple Dagon, in which 3,000 people is on the roof. And this is all the leaders and the priests and, common people too. Samson said to the servant, that would have been a young boy who held his hand, put me where I can feel the pillars that support the temple so that I may lean against them. Now the temple was crowded with men and women. All the rulers of the Philistines were there. And on the roof were about 3,000 men and women watching Samson perform. Then Samson prayed to the Lord. Sovereign Lord, it's a beautiful prayer. Remember me. Please, God, strengthen me just once more. Let me with one blow get revenge on the Philistines for my 2 eyes. Here again, it's a personal thing, but he's also doing it for the nation. Then Samson reached toward the 2 central pillars on which the temple stood. Bracing himself against them, his right hand on the one, his left hand on the other, Samson said, let me die with the Philistines. So he committed suicide. Of course, it was a war thing too. Pushed down the pillars. Pushed with all his might. And down came the temple on the rulers and all the people in it. Thus he killed many more when he died than while he lived. Then his brothers and fathers, whole family, went down to get him. They brought him back and buried him between Zorah and Eshtaol in the tomb of Manoah, his father. And again, it says he led Israel 20 years. That's what the Bible says. You want to say anything about this text?